Thank you all for joining us. So excited to have you all here. We're gonna go ahead and start. We've got a packed hour for you, so we want to get the show on the road. But I'm Helen Smith. I'm the policy advocate with Creation Justice Ministries, and so excited to have you all here with us tonight to learn and hear stories and take some advocacy actions. For everyone joining, this is our Environmental Justice for All policy webinar based on HR 1705, which was introduced in Congress this past March. And its formal name is the A. Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act, which is just a small mouthful. In case you're new to our community or you haven't joined us before, Creation Justice Ministries is a faith-based environmental nonprofit, and we seek to equip, educate, and mobilize faith leaders and all those who feel strongly about using their faith for the good of God's planet and people, because in that way you are a faith leader. We're so excited to introduce this as the first of many policy webinars. We plan to bring them to you quarterly, so we hope that you look out for that and continue to join us for these really important policies that will continue to come out. And we'll kind of be diving into what does the Environmental Justice for All Act contain in it? How does it affect people on the ground? We're going to hear some really great stories from Kaylee and Sister Joan, who are here with me from New Mexico and able to share their experiences. And we have a statement from Representative Grijalva, who is the New Mexico, one of the New Mexican representatives of the House. And he is a main sponsor of this bill. He unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, but was so excited to send his statement. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we'll let Representative Grijalva speak to the bill.
I want to thank Creation Justice Ministry for this opportunity to have a one-way conversation. I apologize for that. I'm sorry I couldn't be in attendance. As we have this urgent conversation and discussion about the strategies that we need to be dealing with immediately, urgently, in dealing with the consequential issue of climate change and the climate crisis before us, I think it's important as well that the urgency of equity and justice in our response to climate change has to be part and parcel of that discussion, not for a later time, not for a time to be discussed in the future, but as a consequential part of the strategy going forward. We cannot deal with the issue of climate change in this country or in the globe without dealing with the issue of justice and equity in terms of communities or of color, indigenous across the United States and across the globe, who will continue to bear the load for the climate crisis as they are bearing it now. We just, HR 1, which was the Republican majority's #1 policy priority, had to do with the issue of energy, but it didn't. It had to do with dismantling fundamental laws that protect communities, fundamental laws that allow public's right to know and the public's right to participate in decisions that are going to affect their lives. And for EJ communities, this process has been denied to them for decades upon decades upon decades. And the concentration of polluting energies, polluting companies, polluting industries, and contamination is concentrated in or around those communities. And I say that because that is backed by fact, that is backed by study, the health consequences, the economic development consequences that have affected these communities for decades and generations will continue and will get worse. If parts of HR 1 are part of this hostage-taking blackmail on the debt ceiling and what budget cuts should occur, I'm very concerned about that. As part of the discussion with the Senate is on on a pipeline that the senator from West Virginia wants very badly. Independent analysis have said that that pipeline over the course of its life is 26 coal plants and 19 million additional fossil burning vehicles on our roads. And that is what we are dealing with. And where would that impact be the most burden? It would be in frontline, backyard, and EJ communities across this country. We cannot ignore 40 million people that are in those communities. We cannot ignore the documented health impacts, negative health impacts about generations and generations of people. And so when last month, when the president signed his executive order on environmental justice, much of what was in that order was the contents of the Environmental Justice for All Act, now called the Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act, for my late departed colleague who along with myself have led this effort along with allied community organizations from across the country. We think this is important, what President Biden did, and we support it. But we also are concerned that as negotiations go forward on HR 1, and in particular on the permitting issue involved in HR 1, that would weaken NEPA, weaken the stance of these communities, that we be vigilant and that we resist and oppose those efforts. And that's what we intend to do. But there's another point here that on the Environmental Justice for All Act, that inevitably it's going to have to be codified into law. The executive order is good, it's solid, but any change of administration means a change of that order. And so we want that law to be codified, to be part and parcel of the rule of law in this country. That insists that cumulative effect be analyzed before any new permit or any new discharge or any new plant or industry is putting communities close to and about environmental justice issues. Second of all, redress. That the flawed decision under Sandoval in the civil rights case before that happened at the Supreme Court, we turn that around and we say that actions taken by a government, by a municipality, by an industry that contaminates and hurts the public health and the well-being and the sustainability of a given community that happens to be of color, that happens to be poor, that they have the right under the Civil Rights Act to sue and to seek legal redress. And the last thing is strengthening NEPA so that communities early on in the process are involved, early on in the process have the right to know, and early on in the process have the resources to be able to do independent analysis of what impact and effects will be, cumulative impacts and effects will be. That's the environmental justice. Those are the three central pillars. And it was developed over a course of 3 years by communities themselves, by EJ communities across this nation that provided the content and the context for that piece of legislation. I'm very proud of it. It is unique in that it came from the community to Congress as opposed to being dictated down from Congress to community. And the last thing I want to say is that, you know, we can't always be playing the defensive on these issues. We can't always be the point of resistance on these issues. So codifying the Environmental Justice for All Act into law gives us a sense of security and a sense of place and a sense and the real tools for communities impacted by decisions, environmental justice decisions that would go against their needs, that they have the opportunity to defend and protect their communities and their families. That's the goal of the legislation. And I think that discussion is the discussion that needs to be going forward. How do we make this permanent and how do we protect it for the long run? Thank you very much.
Wonderful remarks from Representative Grijalva, and so glad that he could record those and send those in to us, even amidst voting in the House. For those of you who are possibly unfamiliar, that beeping in the video is the beep that goes off in every House member's office as a vote is commencing on the floor. So he was definitely taking some important time to be with us and really be there to let us know how important this was for him. I'll now go ahead and move into kind of just a more comprehensive explanation of this act. Representative Grijalva touched on several points of it, and those are really great, but I recognize that this bill is a little bit wonky. It's definitely in the weeds, and I know that we can't all spend our time reading through all of these things and figuring out the definitions and what they mean. So we want to make that easy for you. So again, the name of this officially is the A. Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act. And this was previously introduced in previous Congresses, in part by Representative McEachin, the late Representative McEachin, who unfortunately passed last year, and is now named after him in honor of his hard work on environmental justice and justice for all people. So just a little overview. We'll go over what is even environmental justice, how are we defining that, what are the goals of this bill, the tactics for how to move forward, and then at the end of the webinar, like I said, we'll have a moment where we can all advocate together. And so we are defining environmental justice as the successful integration of conservation and resilience into all communities, especially low-income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, because we recognize that these are the communities that often bear the brunt of climate change. These are the communities that see the negative effects on their water and on their land and in their air. And so when we are making acts, bills, legislation, decisions, we need to think first about the people who are worst affected. And so that is the definition of environmental justice that we are using as we speak about it throughout today. The goal of this bill is to safeguard these peoples. If you are low income, if you're Black or Indigenous or a person of color, having that kind of pollution in your communities does not necessarily mean that those factories closing just fixes the problem. It means that there could be factories that close. They could do poor waste removal. They could do things that are more detrimental in closing. And so especially as we move our economy and our energy, we also have to take into consideration how that affects these communities. And so this bill looks at all of those different things and seeks to put into place ways to protect them and everyone from negative impact. And it recognizes that existing policies can have and do have negative impact on these communities. And so we can go into the tactics. This is the part where it gets a little bit complicated and in the weeds. So there's 5 tactics laid out in this bill. So the first one is strengthening the Civil Rights Act of 1974. This act already has some really great provisions in it, and there were simply a few things where it could be made stronger. That's most of what you'll see in these tactics, making things stronger. So prohibiting disparate impact discrimination. That's a big mouthful. So the Civil Rights Act recognizes that you should not have discrimination based on gender, sexuality, race, color, creed, religion. Everyone should be able to have a clean slate, a fair shake at life. Disparate impact is a Washingtonian way of saying impacts that will negatively affect certain people more. And that is because of environmental injustices, because of the communities where nuclear plants are, the communities where air pollution is, the communities where you have so many manufacturers and coal plants and all these other things. And so by strengthening this part of the Civil Rights Act, you are saying that certain communities, if they are impacted by these things, they can seek legal action. They can be holding accountable those who are hurting them. And they are safe to do so. They have the right to do so. And the courts must uphold the fact that if they are harmed, they should have restitution or whatever settlement they come across. The next one is requiring federal agencies to withhold permits on projects that knowingly cause harm to human health. This is huge, especially in the last 4 to 6 years. We've seen a lot of talk about pipelines, and it might not be clear at first glance what that does, what it means, what the impacts can be. These pipelines are usually used as a faster system for moving energy from one place to another. And just like anything else that you're making out of metal and not doing in a completely straight line, and even if you are, you can't do it all in one piece, there are leaks. And you end up with energy sources that were never meant to be consumed in people's systems. And the people whose systems are most affected are the ones previously mentioned. Those who are low income, those who are Black, those who are Indigenous. So many pipelines happen on Indigenous lands, and other people of color. And so this provision means that when communities then say, this will be bad, this will not be good for us, this will poison our water, our air, this will make our land untillable, the federal agencies cannot produce permits. And that's a huge step in protecting these people's, not decades later when they win a court case, but before the harm has been perpetrated. And that, of course, is the goal. Next, we have directing federal agencies to develop environmental justice strategies and regularly report on the implementation and progress of said strategies. This takes it one step further from the permitting, not only saying you can't permit if you know this is going to hurt people, but also, why are we only waiting until someone's going to get hurt? We need to be proactive about this. Like Representative Grijalva said, this is part and parcel. And so we are going to bake this into the baseline of every legislative act that we can. And that includes the federal agencies that will then be directed to look at environmental justice as a baseline for anything that they're doing and any permitting that they plan to do. And even how they engage with communities, meaning that just like this bill, others will then have community say from the start and not at the end. We have requiring federal agencies to engage with communities in opportunities under NEPA, including representation of Indigenous tribes in the planning and decision-making process. I just touched on this, but of course it means that NEPA is the National Environmental Permitting Assessment. And that's a series of environmental studies that have to be undergone before you can give permits. And often when that process is being done, not everybody's engaged in it. Like the pipeline example I used just a few minutes ago, it can really hurt Indigenous tribes, especially, and especially those out west who have sovereignty and have reservations. That is not necessarily respected as sovereign land, and their rights and their knowledge is not as respected. And so this, again, puts it right there on the forefront of this is something that you have to figure out and talk with other people about before you can ever go forward in perpetrating harm. And then the last tactic is to increase access to parks and recreational opportunities, especially for urban communities that are often under-resourced, recognizing that it is so important to protect air and water and land and human health. But part of human health is enjoying nature. Part of human health is being here and enjoying God's planet, because that's what we were created to do. We were created to run outside and enjoy ourselves and sit against trees. And we aren't building comprehensive legislation if we're ignoring the fact that part of it is enjoyment and being there with the land and being in community with others on the land and in the waters. So those are all very huge concepts to work with and to go through. And we can, of course, make this slideshow available so that you don't have to only worry about me saying it right here. We'll also have the recording available. Somebody corrected me in the chat. Thank you so much. It's the National Environmental Policy Act. I confused it with permitting, but it does require different strategies and steps to obtain permits, but it does stand for Environmental Policy Act. Thank you so much, Steve. Here's my contact information. I'll of course put it in the chat later, and we'll have time for questions later in the webinar. And just so excited to share these exciting things with all of you, because this is a really big deal. And it's huge that we get to have policy and priorities that are really going to take care of people. I'd now really like to introduce Sister Joan Brown to share a place blessing as we acknowledge those who have tended these lands for millennia.
Thank you so much, Helen. And it's just a joy to be here this evening. So thank you so much for the invitation. I am Joan Brown, a Franciscan sister, and I'm the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light here in New Mexico and El Paso. And I'd like to begin our part of the presentation, Kaylee and myself, with a land blessing. Actually, it was given to me to use in different groups by a colleague, a wonderful woman from Santa Clara Pueblo. And this blessing prayer we use in all kinds of ways, even in public permit hearing meetings, to set a stage of a respect and focus us on what is important. And she has invited those of us who are part of the Communities for Clean Water Coalition to use this in groups. And so I am standing right now on Tiwa land. And so I will use that recognition that you, wherever you are, can just state what lands you are on. Everyone here walks, lives, and breathes within these sacred lands of Tiwa peoples. As we begin our activities, let us fully acknowledge where we are and give thanks for living mountains, valleys, and waters which sustain our lives and form ancestral homelands and those of land-based peoples. Let us ground our activities in awareness of where we are, and may the mannerisms of the Tiwa peoples enter our lives and fill us with gratitude, love, care, and respect for all that is shared between us and all beings. Blessed be, amen.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was wonderful. And so grateful for the Tiwa people in both creating that and sharing it for others to use. I'd now like to introduce Kaylee Shoup. Kaylee is a young woman who was born and raised in Carlsbad, New Mexico. In 2018, she moved back to her hometown after living elsewhere for more than 5 years and quickly realized that the community she was calling home had been transformed by the Permian oil boom. In 2019, after watching a young friend battle a rare and aggressive cancer and her own mother dealing with ovarian cancer diagnosis at the age of 50, she began to deal with she began to realize that she knew an abnormal amount of people who were dealing with devastating diagnoses at a very young age. And this is when her passion for environmental activism was truly awakened. She began working with Citizens Caring for the Future in 2020 and feels incredibly grateful to know and work with other concerned citizens, grassroots activists, and environmental stewards in the state of New Mexico. Kaylee, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so happy to be with you folks today. I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a small, short little slideshow. Get this full screen on. All right, can everyone see that? Okay, and is it full screen? Because on my end, it's not for some reason.
No, it's not in present.
No, let's see, let's try that again. Maybe it'll work this time. Well, we might just have to stay like this. I don't want to be messing with it the whole time. So hello, everyone. My name is Kaylee Shoup, and I am the lead community organizer with a small grassroots environmental advocacy group called Citizens Caring for the Future. We're based in Southeast New Mexico in the heart of the Permian Basin oil field. And we are more or less the only grassroots environmental advocacy group of our kind in the entirety of the Permian Basin, which, to put that into perspective, is the Permian Basin is West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. It's comprised of those two regions. It's about the size of Kansas, and it is the most active oil basin in the country. So when you think of it that way, it's quite terrifying that we are the only grassroots environmental advocacy group in the entirety of the Permian Basin. And that is for a myriad of reasons. The Permian Basin is in a region that is quite conservative and has some extreme political ideology. And so, you know, that plays into people being able to get involved in these things. It's also an area that is quite individualistic in terms of culture. And then also there are other reasons. Things like the workforce, a lot of the workforce in the oil and gas field here is immigrants. And these are folks that are, you know, undocumented and cannot risk speaking out against their employer or voicing any kind of concerns. And then a lot of the economies here in the region, well, the main driver of the economy is oil and gas. So when you speak out against these things, you can be quite chastised or, you know, kind of, you know, negated from your community a little bit. So I would say that's the myriad of reasons that you don't have folks in the Permian really speaking out on these problems. And there's also the sheer volume of the amount of production that is going on here. I think people get a little bit overwhelmed when they think about, well, how can I even begin to put a dent in what is happening here, slow down any of this production, any of this, you know, development that is happening in the region. I just looked up the rig count today. We have 356 oil and gas rigs here in the Permian as of today. So that means we have 356 new oil and gas wells being drilled today here in the Permian. So just like the sheer volume of what's going on also plays into people's hesitancy with getting involved with these things. And I say all of this to say that's why it's so important that we need this Environmental Justice for All Act, so we have more tools in our toolbox to fight against these things. Seeing, you know, the provision that keeps the federal government from granting permits when they know that harm is done by these developments. Here in the Permian, that would be huge. So in the Permian Basin, we are out of compliance with national ambient air quality standards for ozone. And yet every day new sites are being permitted left and right, and it's not slowing down. And so having even more safeguards and stopping the federal government from being able to permit these sites would really be huge in a region like this. A little bit about Citizens Caring for the Future. Citizens Caring for the Future began in the fall of 2019, and it was actually started by faith leaders. So we have Sister Joan Brown, who I work very closely with. She is the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light New Mexico El Paso region, and she leads these Permian faith immersion retreats. And there was one in 2019, and this is where she brings faith leaders from northern New Mexico, but then other regions, you know, such as South Texas, just different areas. and brings them to the Permian, shows them around, and lets them see what is happening here, because it is kind of quite profound and you can't really grasp it until you come and you see what's happening on the ground. And they had a retreat in the spring of 2019, and she had some faith leaders from Southeast New Mexico speaking to this group of people. And when the faith leaders from Southeast New Mexico heard each other talking, they realized that they all had the same concerns, things like people in their life getting sick with these, cancers, these different mystery illnesses, things like traffic and cost of living. And at that point, they decided, well, you know what, we really need a group that is, calling out what is happening here, advocating for different safeguards, things like that. And that's when Citizens Caring for the Future was born. So these are just some photos of things that we've done. We've had one of our leaders speak at COP25. This is folks out with a FLIR video camera with Earthworks. Earthworks and IPL played a vital role in getting Citizens Caring for the Future off the ground in the beginning. And then go to our next slide. This is just an example of what you see through a FLIR video camera. This is showing you pollution that is invisible to the eye. But this is methane pollution. See, you have holes in the top of equipment out here. All these things that you can't see without a drone overhead. And I'm going to play a video for folks just so you can kind of get an idea of how vast the Permian is and what is going on here. And this features leaders from Citizens Caring for the Future as well.
I don't hear sound.
And we checked for that. You can't hear it. You can now? Okay, good.
In the past decade, the Permian Basin emerged as the world's single most prolific oil and gas field. Located in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, the basin was producing as much oil in early 2020 as Iraq, over 6 million barrels per day. Only Russia and Saudi Arabia produce more oil on a daily basis. In the decade ahead, as the world grapples with the impacts of COVID-19 while tackling the mounting climate crisis, oil and gas production in the Permian Basin is still projected to grow substantially to become one of the world's largest sources of climate pollution. The Permian Basin is exploited using horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, a method that requires intensive drilling and massive quantities of water, sand, and toxic chemicals. Oil production in the basin grows, so does the production of methane gas and gas liquids, a mixture of ethane, propane, butane, isobutane, and pentane. These are the toxic and climate-potent byproducts of the basin's oil boom that impact people's health and their lives. The scale of the basin's potential to produce this wide range of hydrocarbons not only marks the basin as a carbon hotspot, but as a major source of plastics, one of the world's other 21st century environmental crises. Spread over a mostly remote area the size of Kansas or Britain, drilling in the basin is barely regulated. Tens of thousands of wells have been drilled and fracked in the past decade, covering an area of nearly 6,000 square miles or 15,000 square kilometers. The drilling frenzy has led to waste on a massive scale. Methane gas, which accelerates climate change at over 80 times rate of carbon dioxide, is vented and flared at unprecedented rates. A recent study estimated that a stunning 3.7% of gas produced in the Permian Basin is venting into the atmosphere. This places Permian Basin oil and gas among some of the most climate polluting in the world. It multiplies the climate impact of the basin's production, creating a toxic legacy in a vast mountain desert landscape with extraordinary biodiversity. Basin scale and unregulated growth has overwhelmed the US markets for its products. Most of its oil and gas is exported to global markets. To facilitate its growth, a massive build-out of gas processing plants, pipelines, export terminals, and petrochemical complexes has emerged, creating a network of industrial pollution from southeast New Mexico to the Gulf Coast of Texas. This has intensified existing environmental injustice and racism across this vast region and is spreading it to areas yet to experience. As the world deals with the COVID-19 crisis.
So that video is a little bit older, but it gives you a great perspective of what is happening here in the Permian and how it's also impacting other regions and the world over when it comes to climate change. These numbers have changed. This was before the conflict in Ukraine. So I'm sure Russia is probably producing less now. We're producing more. But that's just a little bit about the Permian. And I think my time is up. So I'm going to hand it over to Joan. But thank you all for having me today.
Thanks so much, Kaylee. That's so harrowing and so important to see, even though it's saddening and just heart-wrenching what we've done. I'm so excited to have Sister Joan speak. As she shared before, she is a Franciscan sister, and she is the executive director of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. She works with people of faith and conscience and faith communities to address causes of climate change, work towards just transition from fossil fuels through education, interfaith prayer, engagement and energy efficiency, and solar for houses of worship, community tree planting and composting, and public policy advocacy. And while she's worked in New Mexico and Southern Colorado for decades, she comes from a family farm in Kansas, where her family still does small-scale farming and ranching. She lives in community in Albuquerque with a Mercy sister, other folks, and an active sourdough starter that feeds a whole lot of chickens and ducks and fruit trees and gardens that are fed by the Escuida system. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, that are traditional to New Mexico. So, Sister Joan.
Thanks so much, Helen. Yeah, and it's a acequia, which is the water distribution system that's actually based on community sharing of water when there's a lot or when there's little. And so thank you again for being here. And I just so appreciated Representative Grijalva's presentation. And one thing that he said just really struck me, and that's it, that the concentration of pollution is often in communities of color, and I would add rural communities and those who suffer economic inequities. And we certainly have that here in New Mexico. And some would say that the whole state almost is considered a sacrifice zone because of this kind of extractivism and kind of a colonization mindset that continues to happen in various industries. So it's so important to be speaking to you all. And as Christians, what comes to my mind, I just like to set a context that I think is really important. Most of us come from a real commitment to Matthew 25, 35 through 40, which is when I was hungry, you gave me to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And that whole sense of service and sharing. And I think that what the next step that we as Christians especially need to take is to see that, and in Catholic tradition, it's called the corporal spiritual works of mercy, that we can't feed the hungry if there's not healthy land and healthy food if it's polluted. And we can't give clean water to drink if the water is polluted. So we have to engage in this advocacy and support, like the legislation that Representative Grijalva was speaking. And so what I'd like to do is just share some kind of stories and a context a little larger, building off what Kaylee shared, which was really important. And we work closely with Kaylee and the folks down in the Southeast in Solidarity. And we do have these immersion retreat experiences there, but we've worked in other ways too throughout the years here in New Mexico. And just a story to start. This happened many years ago to me, and it kind of contextualizes, I think, what our role as people of faith is, in a sense. Ours is to do the advocacy, but it's also to be involved in healing and the relationships. And as Helen, you so rightly said too, helping people to have the ability to enjoy the natural world and the sacred creation we're part of. And a number of decades ago, I was part of a planning of an event, a spiritual event with a sacred run with a fire from a Chimayo, which is a holy place, to Los Alamos National Labs. And it was a peace run. And we were planning it with some folks from San Ildefonso Pueblo. And as we were planning, this one gentleman said to me, well, you are part of the problem. You're a Catholic, you're Franciscan, and you were a colonizer. And all I could say was, that history is true, and I apologize, and I'm sorry. But what it did for me inside was to say, no matter what I do, whatever we do as people of faith, we need to be about healing. And at deep, deep levels. And what does that mean? And so that means, advocacy, that means, working at those levels. So here in New Mexico, the nuclear fuel chain is a huge issue. And we have engaged with people from the very beginning who still suffer from the Trinity site explosion, the first nuclear bomb that was detonated in the desert around Carrizozo. Hispanic families, traditional farmers who were not even warned nor recognized that they were there, and who are still suffering from generational cancer and still trying to even get recognition from the federal government that they're suffering from this and that they were victims. And then related to them are the uranium mining workers. We have a lot of uranium mining legacy, and it goes actually into Arizona, but it includes a whole large belt in New Mexico, clear almost to Albuquerque. And those miners have not gotten recompense. And there's also hundreds of uranium mine sites that are still causing water pollution and generational cancer, and even, within birthing of children. And there's the largest open pit uranium mine on Laguna land, Laguna Pueblo, one of the 19 pueblos here in the state. And it's a Superfund site, but that has not been cleaned up either. So there's a lot of legacy issues here in New Mexico. And then to move from that, we go to Los Alamos, which is still producing pits and bombs, triggers for the bombs for nuclear weapons. And there are some 1,200 canyons around this large mesa where there has been waste put over the decades. And so now it's coming into the water. And right now, the folks of San Ildefonso Pueblo are very concerned because there's a chromium, which is very, very dangerous plume that goes is under part of it's like the edge moving into their land. But also that land was basically taken for this project of nuclear weapons without the consent or even the conversation or even letting the folks that live there know. And it's sacred land to the folks from Santa Clara and San Ildefonso and other pueblos and people. And so it's just very, very sad and difficult. So one of the groups that we work in solidarity with is called Communities for Clean Water, trying to protect the water and work collaboratively to address that. And just so you know that advocacy and these kind of things can make a difference. A number of years ago, collectively, we had a lawsuit against the federal government for violation of the Clean Water Act. And that lawsuit was one which is very, very unusual, so that there's more accountability but it's constant, continual calling accountability and fighting against further exploitation. Our state is also, and then we moved to the nuclear waste. And so Kaylee was explaining Southeast New Mexico. And in addition to all of the oil and gas, and we often see this in affected communities, there's disproportionate pollution and adverse effects there. So there's also the WIP site, which is for low-level nuclear waste from the DOD and DOE in our country. And there's a Urenco, which is a uranium enrichment plant there. And now we have been fighting as a state to stop Holtec, which would place all of the spent nuclear fuel rods from all the nuclear power plants across the country into one place in that area right there in Southeast New Mexico. And so the state doesn't want it, our federal delegation doesn't want it, but it really is up to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They've just approved the project, and so it's probably going to go into litigation. So that's the nuclear fuel chain. Then, as Kaylee explained, we have lots of oil and gas in the southeast part of the state and the northwest part of the state. And then added to this, with the oil and gas, it's causing large effects on our climate. And we are also a border state. And, I've worked with and talked with some of the folks coming from Central America and some other places, and they are seeing the effects of climate change. And so they are being displaced. And we also have internal displacement in this, the droughts, the fires, et cetera, because of climate change. And the folks from Central America, which are ground zero in our particular region of the world for climate, and coming to say, well, we haven't been able to grow food for 4 years. We've had drought. Our families are hungry. We're starving. That's why we're coming. And at this point, we have not recognized climate refugees or have that kind of assistance that happens when we have recognition of that. So, and then, of course, we have the oil and gas, and I've heard many stories. IPL started working down there over a decade ago, or about a decade ago, because our board said, well, what are the areas in our state that are kind of like forgotten, where there's, challenges and nobody is working with folks or listening to them, actually, and then how might we work with? And the board said, well, Southeast New Mexico is kind of a forgotten region. And so then that began this long journey. So in the process, I heard many, many stories of people suffering, as Kaylee said, from cancers and health problems, and some not even realizing that they had oil and gas facilities in their backyards because it's just so there, you don't even think about it. And so our work is one of advocacy, it's education, it's prayers. When we do the immersion retreat experiences, we have blessings and healing prayers in the field, in the oil and gas field, and it's getting people to commit to deeper action, to advocacy, to solidarity. So we also have other things in the state, mines, copper mines, have gold mines, et cetera. But I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sister Joan. So incredible, and there's so many things that we're facing, and it can be a little overwhelming. But I know when we all work together, it can come together. We want to take this time to give a few minutes of question and answer. If anyone has some questions they'd like to ask, either about the bill or to Kaylee or Sister Joan, feel free to put those in the chat, and we can go through and answer them. or in the Q&A box. I see we've already got that. So the first question is asking, in order to accelerate climate change related alternative energy projects, is there activity in Congress to expedite environmental permitting for green energy projects? And are we aligning those goals with this Environmental Justice for All Act? Currently, there are not, there's not legislation in the House to align permitting with green energy projects. I haven't heard of any in the Senate either, but it would be a little more likely given the structure of it right now. I don't think we're likely to see that. It would be phenomenal, and we would very much be in favor of it. But given the permitting process currently and the efforts to kind of gut permitting in general, we unfortunately do not have some really great legislation moving forward that would expedite permitting for green energy projects.
Helen, could I jump in? And that's absolutely correct at this point. But one thing that Representative Grijalva mentioned about this, trying to dismantle these rules and all, which are really essential, and NEPA and those things, is to contact members of Congress to say, we cannot loosen that. So that would be an action item. But the other thing that is happening is the funds from the Inflation Reduction Act that need to go to low-income communities of color, those who are most affected by the pollution and who are trying to transition. And so there are funds for those communities to utilize, and that's quite important right now to get on board with that if communities are working on some projects or would like to, because that expedite and move forward the transition and also provide for newer future jobs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've also got someone from the House Natural Resources on with us. You can see in the chat, Marilyn Zepeda Salazar. And we've got stuff from Representative Grijalva. I misspoke. There has been an introduction in the House called the Earth Act to Stop Climate Pollution by 2030, which would help to align some energy permitting, but it has only been introduced. There has not been a floor vote that passed it through the House yet. And unfortunately, given that it's quite Republican heavy right now, I don't see that passing in the next couple months. Let's see. Any other questions that people want to ask either in the chat or in the question and answer box? Always feel free to reach out, and Creation Justice Ministries would love to talk about these things at any time and answer your questions as best as we are able, or to talk to the people who can answer those questions, because we do have the privilege of a wide network. I'd like to invite people to go ahead and take advocacy action with us. So I've just put in the chat where you can find your representative's phone number and a call script. If you're on the East Coast, you're going to get a voicemail because it's after 5 p.m. That's totally fine. You can leave a message. They do listen to them. And we got one other question that just came in asking, are the Permian Basin walls pre-permitted, and how they can do so many all the time? I don't know if you know the answer for that, Kaylee.
So I know, like, for instance, BLM, when they do oil and gas leasing, when they sell a lease parcel, they do not then have a permit to drill. That is a separate process, but they can hold those leases for, years. It could be a decade, even more. So that's on that side of things. In Texas, where it's private land, a lot more private land, I'm not sure what the permitting process is when it doesn't have to go through, say, a BLM office or something like that. But the environmental agencies, definitely in Texas, but also in New Mexico as well, are really just, rubber stamping some of these permits despite cumulative impacts, despite, air pollution that is well documented at this point. And so it's different from state to state, I guess would be my answer there.
And I think, Kaylee, that's so good. And I think that points out, again, just the importance of this, act that Representative Grijalva is trying to support and put forth so that communities have more of a voice and can address this. Like, even in New Mexico, the whole state now does not want the Holtec, and yet the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said yes to it. So these kind of things that Representative Grijalva is doing are just quite, and others are, will make a bigger difference.
Mhm. Absolutely. I realize it's a little bit of a difference when we're on webinar versus a regular Zoom call. So we can't see each other making calls. That the script is there for you, of course. And here is a larger one if you'd like to use these last few moments for calling. I've put my email in the chat so you can contact me with other questions. I can always talk with Kaylee and Sister Joan if you have questions for them as well. And we're so excited that you joined us today, and so excited to have you with us to learn and to support each other in this work, because it can be very scary if we do it on our own, and that's definitely not what we want it to be. Yes, I can put that in the chat again. So I'll go ahead and
And while you're doing that, Helen, I might just share, I was just in DC last week for a national IPL meeting. And this was one of the things that we also talked about with, our delegates, as that was appropriate. And, so there is among some delegations a real gratitude that this is happening. And just another word about that too, for folks that are advocating. I would think that many states would want to hear from the constituents, even about local concerns. So I took, with CCFF, a local concern about the ozone non-attainment to our delegation, and they were quite interested and concerned and said they wanted to act on that. So people of faith saying, these are concerns, they know that it's coming from a place of ethical, moral, spiritual grounding. And that speaks in large volumes, because even some of the stuff that we presented, several of the offices said, well, I'm glad you brought some paper or something to me or a letter signed by faith communities, because that'll help us when we're talking to our other colleagues who are people of faith, but maybe don't agree. And so it's just really, I just want to emphasize, it's very important.
Yeah. And I see that you can't copy the chat for the call script, but I have also put our environmental justice support policy fact sheet in the chat, and you should be able to click that link to have it open. And that has the call script in it as well. So the fact sheet contains ways to advocate. And we will be sure to share both the link for the fact sheet and any other links from Sister Joan and Kaylee in the follow-up email. So in the coming days, you'll get a follow-up email, not only thanking you for being here tonight with us, but it will contain the recording of this webinar, and it'll have any relevant links And we'll of course also put it on YouTube and our social media so that this can be accessed and shared out. And we just want to say another thank you so much for being here with us and for learning with us.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Hope everyone has a great night.
You too.